Archaeologists then uncovered a great city, its straight streets as carefully laid out as modern New York. It was one of the most remarkable settlements of the ancient world. An artist's impression can suggest what life was like there more than 4,000 years ago.
Mohenjo-Daro, the place of the dead. Yet this desolate spot is one of the world's first cities, and it may hold the key to one of the most intriguing enigmas of human history. How did civilization begin? How did cities emerge in just a few places of the earth some 4,000 or 5,000 years ago? As an archaeologist, I've excavated in Greece, seeking an answer to just that question. What were the first civilizations like? What made them tick? How, after thousands of years as peasants and villagers, did men come together to create great cities, build palaces, invent new technologies, devise writing? So it's a fascinating experience to come here, to the Indus Valley, to the very heart of Indian culture, to seek some hints about this mysterious process.
Two very early civilizations were already known. In the Nile Valley, ancient Egypt. In the valley of the Tigris, the civilization of Sumer. And now came a third in the valley of the Indus River, the civilization of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. The waters of the Indus River, which give India its name, bring life to the arid plains of what is now Pakistan. On the river are boat people, who may have lived there even before farming began. Fishermen who knew the ways of the river and how to live off the land. They may have hunted the wild animals, even cattle, for centuries before they were domesticated. Then came farming, and the floodplains turned into fertile fields. The rich harvest could now support settled villages, and ultimately the great cities of the Indus Valley like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Mohenjo-Daro means the Mound of the Dead, a colossal area with the extensive excavations of streets and houses in the lower city and of public buildings on the higher mound to the west. The ruins cover an area of nearly 4 square miles. Streets and houses built of brick are dominated by a later Buddhist building. We know now that all of this, apart from the Buddhist stupa, dates from before 2000 BC. It was a great urban city area, with long straight streets laid out on a sophisticated rectangular grid plan with a good drainage system. The houses were well designed and often several stories high. The city was completely unknown until the work of Sir John Marshall, director of the Archaeological Survey for India. He announced his great discovery in 1924 in the pages of the Illustrated London News. Not often has it been given to archaeologists to look upon the remains of a long-forgotten civilization. We are upon the threshold of such a discovery on the plains of the Indus. He worked with hundreds of men, uncovering vast areas of the town at great speed. Perhaps his most interesting discovery was what came to be known as the Great Bath. Sealstones with the mysterious Indus script and curious clay figurines gave a clue to the kind of people who'd lived there. Sir John Marshall recorded and drew and planned everything that he found with meticulous care. In 1950, another great English archaeologist, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, dug at Mohenjo-Daro. He uncovered a monumental building of brick, which he identified as the granary of the town. Today, the leading British authorities in this area are Dr. Raymond Allchin and Dr. Bridget Allchin of Cambridge, who've made a special study of the Indus civilization and its origins.
30 years ago, it was thought that the Indus civilization had no known origins, was mysterious and came out of the blue. Some people thought that it was the result of colonizers from Sumer or outside moving into the Indus Valley and so on. Now we have a completely new picture which has been emerging over the past 30 years, bit by bit, and most particularly in the last 10 years with the excavations which the French team are doing at Merga. There we have really got the very beginnings of the settled agricultural life in the Indus Plains. We see during this period the actual domestication of cattle taking place. They had sheep and goat, and they cultivated wheat and barley.
Farming began then on the Indus Plains as early as 5,000 years before Christ. This allowed a great increase in population, and the surplus produce led to trading. With this prosperity came the growth of cities. Water has always been a critical resource. Without it, life and cultivation could not exist. Wells, lined with brick, are one of the most characteristic features of the cities of the Indus. They were made of triangular bricks.
At first sight, it's a very curious feature, this column of brick, like a great factory chimney. In fact, it's a well, and it's a well which gives a clue to how the site developed. At the last phase of its use, the ground level was right up there, and Sir John Marshall and his colleagues have dug down and down in the course of their excavation to where I'm now standing. But Mohenjo-Daro, like all early sites, grew. The ground level went up as debris collapsed and was left, and walls were built on it and so on. And at this site, the interesting feature is that the walls continued to grow. They built on the ancient walls. They built on the ancient well. So here is the ground level of the first phase, and the well was built on, up and up. You can see a change in the brickwork there, until after centuries, this ground level was finally reached. The whole city is made of these baked bricks, which are of a very standard size throughout. And this is a sign of prosperity, because to make bricks like this, you need a great deal of firewood. And most of the ancient cities in the Near East were made simply of unbaked mud brick. It's also, of course, the reason why the city is so well preserved. The brick walls have survived remarkably, and there's no less than 79 feet of deposit at Mohenjo-Daro, which of course makes it something of an archaeologist's paradise.
One of the interesting things about the Indus Valley is the great continuity in local customs. Suddenly you realize how chaff from threshing must have been an important fuel for firing the bricks. This would have been so 4,000 years ago, just as it is today. Bricks are still the basic building material of the area. Modern peasant life can provide a wonderful source of inspiration to the archaeologist.
Oh, I became interested many years ago when I was in the army in the wartime in India. And I was then struck by the impression which the rural population gave of living in a standard of life and style of life which had been unchanged for a very long time. And this aroused in me a great interest in how far the Indus civilization represented the beginning of this particular style. And this has remained one of my long-lasting preoccupations ever since, the examination of the Indus civilization and its later development. I think if we were able to go back into Mohenjo-Daro during the Indus period, we should feel very much at home because I believe we should find that the cities were very much like the modern towns of Punjab and Sindh.
This is one of the great thoroughfares of the ancient city. The excavators called it First Street, and it runs north and south absolutely straight for nearly a mile, with intersections every 300 or 400 yards. It's the earliest example of street planning in the ancient world. And you can imagine the whole place filled with a bustle of people, street vendors, beggars, yapping of dogs, and above all, the trundling of the great wheels of the bullock carts and the cries of their drivers. But down these narrow side streets, there was only room for pedestrians to walk. And now one enters a different world, a dark maze of narrow little streets with high walls. And there are no facades at all. These are courtyard houses turned in on themselves, so there are no doors or windows to the outside. And in summer it's baking hot. This is a standard-sized street. The excavators called it Low Lane, and we can imagine here a busy throng of people, awnings overhead to make it cool and dark underneath, ladies in their brightly coloured robes, one with a pitcher on her head perhaps, others wearing jewellery, a priest with his robe on one shoulder, all the life of a busy commercial centre. Big cities have a problem, and that is drainage, sanitation, and here they solve the problem in a rather good way. This is a downspout from a bathroom, a shower room, and the water would come straight down through the wall into the street below and be carried away by the central drain. Waste disposal presented its problems, however, because there was the solid rubbish to dispose of, and some of that came down through these rubbish chutes, and also some of the material from the latrines, so it can't have smelt very pleasant. But there were rubbish disposal men, and all in all, this was a very well cleaned and maintained city, much cleaner than most cities ever were in the Middle Ages. This is one of the private houses of the city. And in this room, which was a little courtyard open to the air, they would prepare the food. Querns have been found for grinding the corn to make flour, and they'd boil the rice in bowls or the vegetables. And then over here, also on the ground floor, is the bathroom. They're obviously very great on cleanliness at Mohenjo-Daro. And here they would take a shower. No bathtubs have been found. A shower or maybe a pitcher of water was poured over to have a good wash before one went up by the great stairway onto the first floor.
The main rooms were probably upstairs, where they could catch any cooling breezes. There were many different house plans. Some of the houses were 2 or 3 stories high and probably had flat roofs. We can imagine them hung with brightly coloured cloths, and perhaps the floors covered with carpets.
Now we know, for example, that the earliest cotton seeds in the world have been found at Merga in the Neolithic period already. We know that cotton was one of the great products of the Indus civilization, and now we believe that it has a prehistory in the earlier developments of the Indus Valley. Therefore, it may be that the Harappans were great textile producers, just as Indians and Pakistanis have been throughout all subsequent periods. And it may be that because of this, we have lost one whole large section of their artistic products and so on.
Their textiles have disappeared, disintegrated, but they were probably made much as today, spinning and weaving the plentiful cotton and coloured with bright vegetable dyes. There's plenty of evidence about the rural economy. Remains of grain have been found, wheat and barley and rice. Quernstones are still used. Only a few delicious glimpses of the people survive. This lovely little bronze figure of a girl just 4.5 inches high, gives a vivid and evocative impression of a dancing girl from the lower city of Mohenjo-Daro. I wonder what kind of music she was dancing to. Here we see the informality and vivacity of the people. She gives a feeling of great freedom and movement, suggested by those thin adolescent limbs, and in that striking pose. She has big, attractive eyes. She wears no clothes at all, just her armful of bangles and a necklace of semi-precious stones. Only a few pieces of jewellery have been found, just enough to give a hint that there were some wealthy people in the city. What the jewellery does show is the remarkable level of craftsmanship. It's seen especially in the working of beautiful hard stones like carnelian and agate. These finds and the seal stones also reveal the extent of trade. Indus Valley seals have been found as far away as Suma. Many fine stones were imported, including turquoise. This pendant has a delicate inlay of little lapis lazuli beads traded from Afghanistan, which, despite their size, are beautifully capped with gold. Finely beaten gold headbands were perhaps the insignia of some great lord. A stone sculpture is shown wearing a gold headband of similar design. This is the only good portrait we have, and it's very strong. Of course, only a fraction of Mohenjo-Daro has been excavated, and there could be more finds like this to come. Is he perhaps a ruler of the city, or is he a priest with his elaborately decorated robe? We have very few clues about the top people, about how Mohenjo-Daro was governed. No palace has been found, no really rich graves containing fine possessions. They may, of course, be there in areas of the site not yet investigated. The identity of the rulers remains one of the most puzzling features of the Indus Valley. Another question still unanswered by these apparently faceless walls is the nature of the language. The first inhabitants of the area whose language is known to us were the Aryans, speaking an Indo-European tongue related to our own and those of most of Europe, as well as Pakistan and North India today. Was a similar language spoken here 1,000 years earlier? Or was the Indus speech related to those of South India, a group of languages known as Dravidian? The Indus writing could tell us, if we could decipher it. The Indus script is found on many of the seal stones, and very tantalizing it is. Probably writing was more commonly used on palm leaves, but these would have decayed away. These seal inscriptions may have had a religious significance, or they may have been made for official purposes. In Finland, at the University of Helsinki, is one of the leading specialists on the Indus script. There have been several attempts at a decipherment by various scholars, Russian as well as Indian, and the solution by Professor Asko Parpala seems to be one of the most plausible.
I happen to have a friend who is a computer mathematician, and he asked whether I would be interested in doing something with the computers, trying to apply it to my field. And I thought that the Indus script is a major problem where it would be interesting to try this new technological assistance. So the first thing to do was to collect all the inscriptions, to translate them into numerical form so that they could be fed into the computer, then get some various computer printouts. The computer can be used for making various sorts of indexes that we have seen here printed out. it can also draw these indexes, Indus characters, which would be very laborious to do by hand. Then it can also calculate exactly all the combinations of various signs. Then it can compare the individual combinations of each sign with the same thing of other signs. And on the basis of such combination curves, it can classify these signs into different groups. Perhaps the first thing was to establish the nature of the writing. Now there are about 400 different signs, which means that this cannot possibly be an alphabetic script. The maximum number would be 50 in that case. So it has to be either syllabic or earlier logosyllabic or logographic script. Now the age of the writing rather points to a logographic script, which is the first phase of real writing. And another thing is the shortness of the inscriptions. If you have just one sign in an inscription, it cannot be a syllable, it must be a word. Obviously, it is most economical to start with the most likely language possibilities. And Dravidian is by far the most likely alternative. The two signs that I would like to quote as fairly certain are a sign looking like an arrowhead, another looking like a fish. The fish sign occurs mostly in the position immediately before the arrowhead sign, which probably denotes a dedication or gift to God. So from this position you can conclude something about the intended meaning. I think that as the work slowly progresses, it will be possible to find more interlocking interpretations, which would make the achievements that we have so far to look more convincing. But I'm quite sure that it will never be possible to decipher all the signs of the Indus script, because many of them are so stylized that you simply cannot recognize the picture represented.
Professor Parpala thinks the language of the Indus civilization was Dravidian, like the modern speech of South India. But I myself wonder if it wasn't really an Indo-European language, like the earliest documented speech of the region. It isn't possible yet to be sure. If we could read the script, we might know more about the organization of the city, how it was governed, and the life of its craftsmen. Pottery was one of the most important and useful products. It was made locally. It's clearly wheel-turned and very carefully fired. Pieces of the familiar red pottery with black-painted decoration are found all over the site. Local villagers still use similar pots with the same kind of shape and decoration today. Once again, to understand how it was made, it's helpful to look to modern village life. The pot is turned on a turntable driven by a foot wheel. These are all procedures which resemble those of ancient Mohenjo-Daro. The pots are painted in the same way, and in shape and decoration the results are very similar. Today no kiln is used, but they are found at Mohenjo-Daro. Now the pots are just fired in the open. So present village methods are actually simpler than those used in 2500 BC.
Probably during that time there was slightly higher rainfall, and perhaps the rainfall was a little better distributed throughout the year, and the conditions were generally a little more humid, just marginally so. Enough, though, to make a difference to the wildlife and the opportunities for keeping animals for grazing, the pasture, as it were, for animals which were in the charge of perhaps semi-nomadic pastoralists, rather like those we see in many parts of the subcontinent today. And there we know they had all the domestic animals we see today, apart from the horse. They had, and cattle, sheep, goats, pig. But the whole environment would appear to be, in many ways, of course, very much like it was 100 years or 200 years ago. You see, you have rhinoceros on the seal stones, you have tiger, and you have certainly several types of cattle and other curious animals, which may be mythical animals, but I think elephants. So I think that a great many of the animals were actually there. Some of them were, no doubt, fabricated a little bit, or improved and modified a little bit by the perhaps an artistic convention of the seals, we don't know. But all the indications are that we had a wildlife like we see today, only more so.
I'm standing on the floor of one of the great buildings of Mohenjo-Daro, right in the middle of the citadel, the state granary. It's a colossal brick platform, and it's cut by these channels, which were the vents for the air to circulate underneath the floor to keep the grain dry. Then there are slots for the wooden uprights to support the ceiling. Sir Mortimer Wheeler called this the state treasury, and he was quite right, because it was here that the wealth was brought, all the grain right into the city centre, all from the fertile fields of the Indus Valley floodplain.
This is how the great granary may have looked, as reconstructed by Sir Mortimer Wheeler following his excavations there. The grain was brought in from the fields by bullock cart and stored in the well-ventilated areas. The granaries of the Indus today are still its main wealth, for the craftsmen of the towns and the government officials have to be supported by the produce of the farmers. The control of this production was the essential basis for the government of the state. Then, as now, the grain would be carefully weighed when it was brought in. A system of weights and measures is one of the essentials for any government that wants to collect its taxes. There's plenty of evidence for weighing from the Indus civilization. They had a precise standard like the metric system, and there were different multiples of the unit for fine weighing, for precious metals, right up to massive ones for weighing sacks of grain. Perhaps we see here the origin of Indian mathematics. The toys are an indication of a lively imagination. Even if the streets of the early Indus cities seem lifeless today, the inhabitants 4,000 years ago had quite a sense of humor. There are ingenious games, too. We can recognize them today, and again, some of them have a distinct mathematical flavor. There's a game which looks like chess. It's played on squares, but there may not be enough different pieces for it really to be chess as we know it. The boats still look like one engraved on a seal stone. They must have carried the extensive trade right up the Persian Gulf. The area covered by the Indus civilization is astonishing. Spread over parts of North India as well as Pakistan, it's the largest civilization of the ancient world, and it influenced the life of much of the Indian continent. The second great city is Harappa. The railway was built on bricks taken from the ancient city, which for this reason isn't so well preserved as Mohenjo-Daro. Among the most interesting features are the foundations of the granary buildings, which lie outside the citadel walls. The wealth of the city depended upon a good harvest. Rice was one of the staple crops of the civilization, and there's a whole series of circular floors for pounding and dehusking the grain. As usual, they're neatly laid out in a highly disciplined manner. The most recent excavations here showed how massively these sites were defended. They were conducted in 1946 by Sir Mortimer Wheeler, a master of scientific excavating techniques. He dug a great trench through the fortifications, massive defensive walls of mud brick, and showed for the first time their colossal scale. He carefully observed the successive layers which revealed the sequence of construction through the long history of the site. Among the finds from Harappa and the Indus area are numerous little terracotta figurines, which probably have a religious significance. They're found even earlier, on village farming sites. It's been suggested that they represent a mother goddess and indicate a cult of fertility. They're very mysterious, with their elaborate and puzzling headdresses. No obvious temples have been found at Mohenjo-Daro, and there aren't many direct indications of the religion. Only a few stone cult figures have been found, but there is something very much more suggestive. This is the Great Bath, and it's set in the middle of the citadel. It's truly a monumental structure. There is this spacious courtyard, which was actually a cloister. We can see the pillar bases very clearly.
They were probably faced with plaster, giving a nice white impression, and there was wood at each end, which may have been painted. So we can imagine a whole series of well-defined doorways from the inside into the cloister walk behind. So the whole thing was really very impressive. This wasn't just an ordinary bath for everyday communal bathing. For one thing, it must have been very difficult to fill. All the water had to be laboriously pulled out of a well and tipped into the bath by means of a pitcher. And then there's the outflow. When they pulled the plug out, the water flowed out through an elaborate channel down into a very large culvert. This is the outflow channel, and it has a very fine corbelled roof, especially when you remember that it's nearly 5,000 years old. The water comes straight out of the bath into this narrow channel, which is set in this very large and elaborate and monumental manhole. All of this trouble they went to makes you think there must have been something very special about that water. Down into the bath, there are these steps, which were neatly surfaced with wood. And then there's this parapet, which marks the place where you step into the water. And we know there was water in the bath because these bricks are very carefully laid together and backed with bitumen. In fact, they went to an enormous amount of trouble to build this structure. It's the only thing of this kind in the whole of the ancient world. So I think it's clear there was a solemn, serious purpose. And that must have been religious ritual. There was holy water in the bath. And I think we can imagine the priests coming down the steps and immersing themselves in the water as part of their ritual purification. And that, after all, is exactly what happens in the holy river Ganges today, when the Hindu believers immerse themselves and wash themselves in its waters.
Another feature of the Hindu religion is its veneration for sacred cattle. We see them already on the Indus seals. The holy cattle are garlanded, and very often they have in front of them a curious object which may be a ceremonial manger. We see also a divinity seated in the classic yoga position, who may be a forerunner of the Hindu god, the Lord Shiva, worshipped today in many temple ceremonies.
The main object of veneration in Hindu temples dedicated to the Lord Shiva is the lingam, the male emblem of fertility. So it's suggestive that here at Mohenjo-Daro we find a number of stones of just the same size and shape. Now, of course, there are scholars who are so obsessed with sexual symbolism that every time they see an upright stone, they think it's a phallic symbol. But nonetheless, I think there can be no doubt that these stones do represent the male sexual organ. So here, once again, we have an element of the Mohenjo-Daro religion, and it's one that continues to the present day in Hindu religious practice.
It's very possible that the people of Mohenjo-Daro were the direct ancestors of the inhabitants of the Indus Valley today. Ancient and modern skeletons are similar. But the organization of society and its government still isn't very clear to us, and more archaeological work is needed. One thing is already clear. The life of the cities came to an end. What brought about their downfall? Was it a great natural disaster? A flood, perhaps, or an invasion by barbarians? The fall may have been sudden. Writing ceased and didn't begin again for centuries. The cities were abandoned, fell into ruin, and became overgrown mounds which lay entirely forgotten and unvisited for 4,000 years. This historic film about Mohenjo-Daro was made 25 years ago by the late Paul Johnston, who was one of the great pioneers of archaeology on television. In that film, Sir Mortimer Wheeler put forward his own theory for the end of the civilization.
Then, about 1500 BC, something happened. Sudden tragedy brought this ancient civilization to a violent end. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are back in 1500 BC and are looking out over the straight streets and brick houses of Mohenjo-Daro. Suddenly, smoke and flames begin to rise amongst them. And up one of the main streets, there streams a horde of swordsmen led by a swaying figure in an outlandish chariot. By the chariot pole crouches the charioteer, and every now and then the warrior beside him fits an arrow to a short, stocky bow and discharges it into the panic-stricken groups of fleeing citizens. At another spot, some of the townsfolk cower beside a well, where they were drawing water when they first heard the dreadful sounds of the city's fate. Two of them are now climbing the stairs and have reached the street when the invading mob closes up on them. They drop and are instantly trampled into the sand. A burly fellow with a raised sword turns onto the well-house stairs and cuts down a woman who is struggling up them. She falls backwards across the steps, and the ravening horde sweeps on. The story I'm telling you is not fantasy. It is a literal interpretation of actual discovery. This is the place where one of the massacres took place. 34 centuries after it happened, the archaeologists of the 20th century dug and found these bones of the massacred, mute evidence of how an age-long civilization perished within the hour.
That story of a massacre makes a wonderfully graphic picture. But in fact, I don't think things happened that way at all. 30 years ago, everybody thought of ancient history in terms of battles and migrations and invading hordes. But many early civilizations collapsed, and archaeology gives no evidence of invaders to explain their end. Things are really more complex than that. I like to think of what I call a system collapse. Many early societies simply just broke down, and that is what I think happened here. There was no massacre. Sir John Marshall, when he excavated those skeletons, said he thought they were burials. And later, Sir Mortimer Wheeler put forward this idea of defenders cut down in their very tracks. But later work on the bones has shown that there are no war wounds at all. And all this stuff about an invasion is sheer myth. There is no concrete evidence for it. The Aryans, if they came, could have come a great deal later. We don't need these terrific disasters to explain a system collapse, these floods or these great invasions. The mathematics of catastrophe theory shows us that really sudden events can have quite gradual but cumulative causes. Environmental overexploitation, or continuing population growth, or gradual climatic change. And then suddenly something has to give. Things go critical. The authority of the central power snaps and chaos ensues. Then the granary is plundered. There's no food for the priests, so they abandon the great bath. And the villages around the site are no longer sending in food to the populace. So the place is deserted and abandoned. In our own time, after all, we don't really explain failure by great invasions or massacres. More usually, the cause is environmental degradation, or continuing overpopulation, or simply economic decline.
What happened when the end of civilization comes to an end, however, I think we must be prepared now to think not in terms of the sudden disappearance of the civilization, but merely in terms of the disappearance of certain of its more specifically urban features. The population must have basically remained where it was, the villages must have remained, and the cultures which we know appear over the whole of the region immediately after the end of the Indus civilization must represent the development or regression back into a village society of what originally had been an urban society. Therefore, seals and the urban crafts would tend to disappear first. Probably the use of writing would disappear. whatever the administrative setup was which held it together must have gone, but everything else more or less remained. And that is why it is an interesting thing that, as I see it, the Indian lifestyle continued.
A new disaster threatens Mohenjo-Daro today. The river Indus, which has so often changed its course in the past, is likely to do so again, and what remains of its greatest city may be swept away forever. UNESCO has launched a worldwide appeal for $10 million, most of which needs to be spent on a complicated barrage system to contain the floodwaters of the river. Another and more insidious threat to the city is the rising water table, which is causing salt to destroy the exposed brickwork and the walls to crumble. Pumps are needed to lower the level of the water beneath the site. Only a tenth of the money needed to attempt to save the city has been raised so far. If the remainder is not found soon, Mohenjo-Daro and all its secrets will be lost forever. We know quite a lot about Mohenjo-Daro and its people. We can go into their houses, walk down their streets. We know something about their religion. We know the size and plan of the city and its date, even what they ate. But despite all this, it remains a bewildering place. Everything is so well organized and planned and regimented. They made all their bricks the same size. Their weights are on a standardized system. Even their drains are laid out with painstaking care. But who organized all of this? Somebody, you'd think, must have ruled the place with a rod of iron, making everybody toe the line. But nowhere do we glimpse this great leader. In other early civilizations, you do. You find his palace, his royal statues. But where is the palace here, or the royal tombs? This I find very puzzling. Or are we perhaps on the wrong track? Was Mohenjo-Daro in fact ruled by some college of priests with puritanical thoroughness, or by a people's cooperative with faceless efficiency? Well, we've got some of the clues. Perhaps the others will come when we can decipher the script and read the seal stones. Meanwhile, despite all that we know of the Indus Valley civilization, Mohenjo-Daro remains a fascinating enigma.